So what if we told you that the entire structure of the world, everything you sense and feel, from the tiniest particle of matter to the grand, overwhelming sweep of human history, what if all of it was just a necessary logical product of your own self-consciousness?
That is the central, audacious, and frankly monumental question driving the material we're diving into today. It's really the ultimate philosophical claim to sovereignty for the thinking subject.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are taking a run at one of the densest yet most influential philosophical texts ever conceived. We're looking at excerpts from the system de Transcendental Idealism.
Yeah, and this isn't just dry theory.
Not at all. It's an all-encompassing system. Our sources show that the author's ultimate goal was to unify philosophy, nature, and action into one comprehensive framework, a complete system of the entire will, or how do you say it?
System des gesamten Willens. And this material is, well, it's notorious. It's what you might call peak abstraction. It's the kind of work that can leave you feeling lost in a fog of capital letters and, very specialized terms.
So our mission today, for you, is to be the shortcut.
Crystal clear. We're cutting through that fog to reveal the surprising connections and the rigorous logical necessity behind concepts like the self-consciousness, the ich, and the deduction of the objective world from pure thought. We are starting at the point beyond which we cannot go, and we're going to make that journey from self to the world intelligible and, crucially, memorable.
Okay, let's unpack this enormous mission then.
Let's do it.
So the text begins with a very almost aggressive declaration of intent. The author doesn't really want to summarize Transcendental Idealism, or TI. They want to expand it and demonstrate its proof, not through some static argument, but literally by the deed itself, durch die. That self-effect. What does that even mean for a philosophy to prove itself by the deed?
It means the philosophy is an act of creation, not just description. It's a performance. The author isn't going to just tell you the results of the system. They're going to actively derive the entire reality for you, right here, using pure, unassailable logic.
So it's not a report, it's the event itself.
Exactly. It's a systematic, step-by-step construction of the world from the inside out, starting from a single, undeniable point. The deed is the act of building the system right in front of your eyes, so to speak.
And the author acknowledges that maybe previous attempts at this weren't clear enough. The text stresses that this particular presentation aims for greater clarity, or Deutlichkeit, than previous versions, especially on points where an original lack of sense might otherwise take over. Is this a reaction to people getting confused?
Oh, absolutely. That's a direct shot at the common misinterpretations of earlier idealism. The perception that idealism just leads to, confusion, or worse, solipsism. The idea that only your own mind is sure to exist, that was a major problem.
Right. The classic, is this table really here?
Yeah. Exactly. And the author here insists that if we just follow the deduction carefully, confusion becomes impossible because the system is so logically grounded. It's an explicit attempt to ground the philosophy so solidly that even the most skeptical reader is compelled, step by step, to follow the logic.
Okay, so to get that level of certainty, they have to find the ultimate foundation, the highest principle of knowledge. But the sources are very clear. This foundation has to be sought within knowledge itself. We can't appeal to an external God or, pre-existing objects. Why is looking outside the system immediately fatal to this whole project?
Well, if you look outside the system, if you say, I know X because of Y, and I know Y because of Z, you just fall into an infinite regression. You never, ever reach the absolute start.
You're always just kicking the can down the road.
You are. For idealism, the first principle has to be foundational and completely self-justifying. It has to be the one thing the mind recognizes immediately, without any mediation or prior steps.
So what is it? What's that immediate, unmediated certainty, the starting point?
It's the statement that is certain for all common rational usage. The single, unchallengeable certainty, ich, I am.
Me, I am. It seems so. Deceptively simple, doesn't it? But it's not just a statement of existence. It's the absolute anchor for everything.
It's incredibly profound because the sources call it the individual ultimate of all truths, the individualst aller Wahrheiten. This immediate self-consciousness, this Selbstbewusstsein, is the single, necessary, and indispensable truth.
And you can't really argue with it.
Try it. Try to refute the fact that you are conscious of yourself right now. You can't. The very act of trying to refute it requires the consciousness you're trying to deny. You're using the I am to attack the I am. It's self-defeating.
It's a truth that validates itself in the moment. And the sources note that if you try to analyze or explain the Ich Bin from the outside, after the fact, It loses all meaning. It has to be assumed first. Anything else, anything at all, is to be certain.
It's the condition of possibility for everything else. And here's a really powerful thought, listener. The existence of things outside us, Dinger, außer uns, is only certain for the transcendental philosopher because it achieves identity with that statement ich bin.
Whoa. Okay, let me press on that because that's the moment that I think usually derails people. Doesn't that mean the whole physical world, the chair I'm sitting on, this microphone in front of me, is only real because I think it or through my consciousness? Isn't that just pure solipsism?
It's a fine line, but no, not quite pure solipsism. It definitely centers the subject, though. Here's how the transcendental philosopher would put it. I know I am. That's rock solid. The material world only becomes objectively certain if its mechanism of existence is identical to the necessary mechanism of my own self-consciousness.
So if the world plays by the same rules that my consciousness has to play by.
Then the world is certain.
Okay.
Exactly. If the world required rules that contradicted the fundamental logic of the ich bin, it couldn't be known, and therefore it couldn't be certain for us. It would be alien.
That reframes the problem completely. It's not about my mind creating the table out of thin air. It's about the table being subject to the same necessary logical laws that govern my own self.
Precisely. So now the question becomes, how does consciousness actually move from that single certainty of I am to generating knowledge of a complex world? Well, knowledge, Wissen, in general, rests on the agreement or the correspondence of an objective element, the thing known, and a subjective element, the knowing self.
But if the whole system starts with just the self, the subjective, where does the objective element even come from? It sounds like we need some kind of conflict or opposition.
We absolutely do. The source explains that true knowledge requires the presupposition of opposites, or Entgegengesetz. And since these are opposites, think of them like positive and negative charges, or expansion and contraction, their eventual coming together, their synthesis, can only be mediated, vermittled.
It can't be immediate. There has to be a process.
Right. Knowledge is that process of mediating these necessary opposites. It's the bridge between them.
So all knowledge relies on synthesizing opposing forces.
Yes. And this establishes an overarching rule for the whole system. All knowledge, resting on these mediated sentences, these syntheses of opposites, must ultimately lead back to a single highest principle, ein principle. And that highest principle is what transcendental philosophy seeks to articulate directly, even though for all other sciences like physics or biology, it remains indirect, just sort of operating in the background.
What's fascinating, though, is that the author is incredibly careful not to overstate what this highest principle is. It's not some absolute principle of being, like a cosmic entity or God that a dogmatist might propose.
That's a crucial philosophical move, a really sharp distinction. The source makes it clear that the assertion of this highest principle is a negative and restricting claim. It doesn't tell us what the absolute ground is in some positive, descriptive sense.
It tells us what it isn't or what it can't be.
Or rather, what it limits. It establishes the highest and outermost limit of knowledge available to us. It sets the boundary.
It sets the boundary. That's a great way to put it.
Exactly. It determines the finite boundary within which all possible knowledge must operate. This ensures that the system remains idealist, grounded in the conscious subject rather than dissolving into some mystical external absolute. The entire project is about defining the absolute limit of knowledge, starting from the certainty of the active I am.
The moment you realize that the core principle is a constraint, a boundary, it flips the whole task on its head. It's not about boundless, godlike creation, but about the necessary process of self-limitation that actually makes knowledge possible in the first place.
And that self-limitation is an active process. Which brings us to the next big question. How do we even perceive this process?
Right, if we're starting inside knowledge itself, dealing with this active, self-limiting I, we need a mechanism to perceive this internal process. The text calls this the sole organ of transcendental thinking, the intellectual intuition, the intellectual Anschauung.
Yeah, and this sounds incredibly abstract, I know.
It really does. How can a listener even conceptualize intellectual intuition? Is it just a fancy word for deep reflection or something?
It's far more radical than just reflection. The source emphasizes this is a necessary prerequisite. Without it, all philosophy would be completely unintelligible, just as, say, geometry is unintelligible without the sensible intuition of space. The distinction between sensible and intellectual intuition is the key.
Okay, so sensible intuition, our ability to perceive things in space and time. That's what we use every day. If I look at a shape, I'm using sensible intuition.
Precisely. The object of mathematics relies on that sensible intuition space and time, so its object is fundamentally outside the self, or außerhalb des Wissens. The mathematician looks out and sees a triangle. The philosopher, on the other hand, looks solely at the act of construction itself, the actor construction.
The act of building the triangle in the mind, not the finished product.
Exactly. This act of constructing knowledge or constructing the self is absolutely internal, absolute inner ist. The philosopher isn't observing a triangle or a star. The philosopher is inwardly observing the active, non-sensuous process of the mind, creating the very possibility of the triangle and the star. It's watching the self produce the object.
So it's a direct awareness of your own mind's creative power in action.
Yes. The self, the ish, is called an intuition because through the knowledge of itself, the self, which is now acting as the object of its own gaze, first arises. It is knowledge that simultaneously produces itself as the object.
So it's not looking in a mirror, it's feeling yourself come into being.
That's a great way to put it. Think of it less as seeing and more as a profound, non-sensory awareness of the immediate, constant act of self-creation. If you achieve a moment of radical self-awareness where you feel your own existence as an active force, not just a passive state you're in, you are approaching the concept of intellectual intuition.
Which means the intellectual intuition is to philosophy, what space is to geometry. It's the medium in which the whole subject operates. All the later philosophical concepts like cause, effect, matter, they're just different limitations of this self-elevating act of the self turning itself into an object.
Yeah.
But this act of self-elevation, this self-production, it must immediately cause a logical snag, right?
It creates the fundamental contradiction of the ik, a massive one. To be the absolute ground of everything, the self must be both unlimited, uneinschränkt in its activity. It has to be pure, free, boundless activity, and yet to be an identifiable, concrete subject, me, it must also be limited.
Begrenzt. And absolute without limits is
Exactly.
just nothing specific. It's pure, undifferentiated chaos.
A fog.
Exactly. So if the system is going to avoid collapsing right at the start, this contradiction must be resolved at its very first principle.
So how does the idealist manage to reconcile infinite freedom with necessary limitation? How can you be both at once? The resolution is achieved through a dynamic process. It's mediated by the concept of an infinite expansion of the limit, or unendlichen Erweiterung. The self sets its own limitation by limiting itself. This limit, however, isn't a fixed wall. It's constantly abolished for every specific point, which prevents stagnation, but it is only shifted infinitely further out. Ins unendliche hinausgerückt.
That is essentially a perfect definition of striving, or ambition. The self is constantly pushing its boundaries, but the boundary, the horizon, is always just beyond its reach.
That's exactly right. This limited infinity is the condition under which the ich can be infinitely ich. It can be itself forever. It establishes a dynamic absolute, an engine of activity that never, ever achieves rest. Without this dynamic tension, there would be no philosophy, no world, and no consciousness as we know it.
And this infinite limitation arises directly from that paradox of opposing activities, both of them springing from that single, unified self. It's like the engine is splitting itself into two parts to create the tension necessary for knowledge.
This is where we get the fundamental duality that dictates the rest of the entire system. This infinite limitation is the result of two opposing activities of the same ik. First,
That outward push.
right, one activity pushes outwards toward the infinite, the centrifugal activity. It strives for objectivity, for being not self. And second, the other activity returns to the ik, the centripetal activity, which strives for pure self-reflection and subjectivity.
We're literally seeing the birth of the objective and the subjective world right here in this one motion.
We are. The objective activity, this infinite striving outwards, is what the source calls nature. It's the expansive force. The activity returning to the ik is the self, or the subjective pole. The entire methodology of transcendental philosophy, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, is simply an abstraction of this original foundational process of the spirit creating itself and its world.
So the structure of logic itself is merely a shadow cast by the self-producing activity of consciousness. That is a truly powerful, system-unifying claim. It's breathtaking in its scope.
It is. And now that we've established this dynamic opposition within the self, the nature pole and the self pole, we have to prove that this opposition leads necessarily to the existence of the objective material world.
And the idealist approach here is so interesting. It doesn't start by, observing matter with a microscope. It starts by hypothesizing the existence of reality within our knowledge and then asking what conditions must be met for that reality to exist.
Correct. It's a constructive proof. We derive the conditions a priori from pure reason alone, and if those derived conditions later appear in our experience, then reality is affirmed. But we need an anchor. We need something that tells us the external world isn't just a dream, and what is the true anchor of reality in our experience, what makes it feel real.
It has to be something unavoidable, something you can't just wish away.
It is the feeling of constraint, the Gefühlszwang, which accompanies our cognition. When you
Yeah.
bump into a brick wall, you don't merely perceive the wall visually, you feel constrained, you feel forced back. That feeling of forced limitation is the raw evidence of objective reality.
It's the friction.
It's the friction. And the transcendental philosopher argues that any system that cannot explain this unavoidable feeling of constraint is a failure, a misslungen. It's the necessary grit in the system that makes it turn.
If the entire system is built on the self limiting itself, then this feeling of constraint is simply the self experiencing its own self-imposed limitation in the form of resistance.
Exactly. And that resistance, that feeling of constraint, is what we define as matter. Matter is conceived as a resulting common product, a Gemeinschaften product of those two absolutely opposed activities we just derived from the self.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to the nature of this opposition, because the source is highly technical here.
Right.
It insists that these two activities must be absolutely opposed, not just, mathematically opposite, like +1 and -1.
This is a crucial distinction. It's what separates idealism from earlier mechanical philosophies, like Newtonianism. In math, as you said, positive and negative forces can cancel each other out completely. +1 makes 1, nothing left. But for the idealist, the activity toward the infinite activity 1, the striving, the positive, and the activity that resists it, activity 2, the negative limiting force, they have to be philosophically absolute.
Why? Why does that philosophical necessity override what seems like simple mathematical equivalence?
Because if the forces were just mathematically equivalent, they would neutralize each other entirely. They would result in inert mass, like dead little particles in atomic theory. But the source explicitly criticizes atomism for making arbitrary assumptions, just assigning properties to atoms because they're needed for an explanation.
So it's not a static balance, it's a dynamic tension.
It has to be. The idealist system needs to derive active, dynamic, living forces, not dead matter. The positive force tends toward the infinite. The negative force limits it through active action at a distance. Die, auf in die Ferne wirkt. This isn't just inertia, it's a continuous, reciprocal action that is required to hold existence in a dynamic equilibrium.
And that dynamic opposition is the engine of all natural phenomena. So by examining the interaction of these two absolutely opposed forces, the system derives three distinct moments, which then provide the a priori foundation for a general theory of natural phenomena, of philosophical physics, really.
This is where the abstract logic suddenly grounds itself in observable reality. It gets really interesting here.
Okay, moment one, equilibrium.
This is where the opposing forces are held in perfect balance. Their dynamic opposition results in a stable state. This point is called A, and it is associated with gravitation. Gravity. Gravitation, according to this deduction, is the immediate spiritual influence holding objective reality together. It's the moment of maximum dynamic unity. The source points out that even contemporary natural researchers of the time often had to admit that gravitation seemed like an immediate spiritual influence. They could describe its law, but not its mechanism. Here we get the mechanism. It is the necessary equilibrium of the self's expansive and contracting forces.
Wow. Okay. And what happens when that equilibrium breaks down or is, viewed analytically?
That leads to moment two, the separation. This is when the two forces are viewed as completely separate and partitioned by a boundary, a grenze. They are no longer in simple balance, but are polarized and active against each other across a surface. In nature, the separation is represented by electricity.
Electricity.
Yes, it's described as covering the surface, like static electricity, but not penetrating deeply into the body. It represents that partitioned boundary between the forces.
So electricity is the boundary condition of matter. The separation of the positive and negative poles of the self's fundamental activity. And finally, the synthesis, the striving for reunion.
Moment three is the reunion. Since the two forces were originally unified in the Ich, they must strive for reunion through a third force, a dritt Kraft, leading back to a state of complete internal organization. This final moment of synthesis is linked to magnetism.
Why magnetism?
Because it's a force that, unlike electricity, spreads over the entire surface of the body, seeking unification and continuity. Think of a magnetic field. It's about polarity, yes, but also about the unified field that connects those poles.
That is incredibly elegant. The idealist isn't performing experiments in a lab. They're deducing gravity, electricity, and magnetism purely from the logical necessity of the cell's internal opposition. It replaces the messy, hypothetical world of atomic particles with an elegant system of forces rooted in consciousness.
It promises a theory of natural phenomena that can renounce all hypotheses and fabrications, Hypothesen und Erdichtungen, by making force, rather than inert mass, the fundamental reality.
Okay, so now, moving from the elemental construction of matter to the construction of objects, this process of setting the subjective and objective in relation also leads to a new deduction of Kant's categories, the framework we use to structure reality.
Yes, the categories are the necessary structure of our understanding, and the deduction here relies on the observation that Kant's categories always show the first two as opposites and the third as the necessary synthesis that unites them.
Let's focus on the categories of relation, because they define how objects exist together in the world. What are the three necessary stages of relationship here?
So the three moments are, first, substance and accident. This is the initial assertion of unity. An object is set as existing and unified in itself. That's the thesis.
Okay, a thing exists.
Right. Second, cause and effect. This determines a plurality of objects, one substance acting on another. This breaks that initial unity and introduces a temporal sequence. One thing happens, then another. This is the antithesis.
So things act on each other over time.
And third, reciprocity, or Wechselwirkung. This is the synthesis, where the plurality of cause and effect is united back into a single cohesive system. The objects mutually determine each other simultaneously, fixed in coexistence.
So the mind asserts unity, then breaks it down into sequential action, and then restores unity through simultaneous mutual interaction. But here's the critical point, the one we really need to spend time on. Which of these categories is truly real?
This is absolutely essential to understanding the idealism here. The source argues that in the original consciousness, the ursprünglichen Bewusstsein, only the third category, reciprocity, mutual interaction, is considered real. Real.
Why? Why are substance and cause and effect just, what does he call them, ideal factors?
Because substance and accident are analytical constructs. We only define a thing as a substance because we see its qualities persisting through time. It's a mental box we draw around it. Cause and effect is a sequential analysis the mind performs to structure events in time to tell a story. They are tools of the understanding necessary for analysis, but they do not describe the ultimate reality of coexistence.
So because they are analytical tools, they're ideal. They exist in the idea, in the mind.
Exactly. The ultimate reality of the objective world is that everything coexists simultaneously and mutually determines everything else. The very notion of existence is only possible through the reciprocal action, the Wechselwirkung of substances. Think about it. If two things didn't affect each other in any way, shape, or form, how could they possibly be known to exist alongside each other? Their reality is their interaction. Therefore, reciprocity is the only category that truly reflects the dynamic opposition of the self-made external. It's the objective manifestation of that required feeling of constraint.
That changes how you view time and space completely. Reality isn't about inert objects causing these subsequent effects in a chain. Reality is one massive, instantaneous, co-determining system. The other categories are just cognitive shortcuts we use to make sense of the stream of experience.
That's the radical claim. And having established how material objects and their reciprocal relations are deduced from these necessary constraints, we now have to move to the highest expression of unity in nature, the organism.
Right, because the mechanism of matter, defined by gravity, electricity, and magnetism, is just not sufficient to explain life, is it?
Not at all. And so the failure of mere mechanism forces the system to move into the realm of purpose. That's a smooth transition. The logical failure of the lower concept necessitates the birth of the higher one.
So the organism is the logical next step.
It is. It's the ultimate expression of the unity of those opposed activities, the centrifugal expansion of nature, and the centripetal return of the self-fully realized in the material world.
How does the idealist define this organization then? What makes something alive?
Organization is characterized by the idea that it is simultaneously producer and product producerendus and product in reciprocal interaction with itself.
Producer and product.
Yeah, the simplest example is a plant. It is a product of its seed, but it also produces the seed for the next generation. This constant self-production and self-preservation is what defines life. The organism must appear as a product that, even though it results from blind natural forces or blinder Naturkräfte, is entirely purposeful. Zweckmäßig.
And that's the core paradox of biology, isn't it? A purposeful, intricate outcome emerging from supposedly blind mechanistic causes.
Right, and the source identifies this inherent drive for self-preservation as the highest expression of the absolute synthesis playing out in the time series. This necessary sequence, running through time, establishes a foundation for phenomena that mechanical physics, which only deals with external causes and effects, can't even touch. A mechanism can only react to an external force. An organism acts from an internal purpose.
So let's connect this back to consciousness. Our highest form of organization is our own body.
Absolutely. The highest degree of organic nature provides the mechanism by which the free will, the willkür, or arbitrary will gains objective expression. Think of voluntary movement, speech, or writing. The organism is the perfect instrument through which the intelligence acts in the objective world, translating an internal intention into an external deed.
And this allows the system to offer these powerful philosophical definitions for what happens when the body and mind lose that identity.
Yeah.
So what is disease, according to this system?
Disease, the Krankheitsgefühl, is the partial disruption of the identity between the intelligence and its organism. The body fails to perfectly obey the will or provide the expected sensations. The feeling of illness is, therefore, nothing other than the abolition of the identity between the intelligence and its organ. The self feels alien in its own instrument.
And if disease is the partial abolition, then death or Todd must be the absolute abolition of this identity.
It is. The organism, being fully subject to the natural laws of mechanism and decay, must eventually destroy itself by its own power. The necessary decay of the material product forces the abolition of that identity. Therefore, death is viewed as a necessary natural event, a naturengness.
It's not a moral failing or some cosmic tragedy?
Not in that sense, no. It's the cessation of the reciprocal activity that defines life, following the inexorable laws of nature.
So, if the organism is the mechanism of the free will, and the free will acts in time among other free wills,
Right.
that takes us from the individual life into the collective stream of history.
That's the critical leap. The field of history belongs entirely to the realm of willkür-free, arbitrary will. And because individuals are radically free, the outcome of history cannot be calculated by any theory, mechanical or otherwise. It is fundamentally unpredictable.
And yet, because the system has to be a complete whole, history must have some kind of grand purpose.
It does. The ultimate purpose of history is defined as the continual, ongoing proof of God's existence. But it's a proof that can only be completed through history itself. If God were just some static object in the world, we would lose our freedom. But God reveals himself continually, often Bart sit fortwährend, through the process of history, where free actions ultimately align with a necessary rational plan.
It sounds like a dialectical drama unfolding over millennia. And the source breaks history down into three necessary epochs, right? Reflecting that movement from unconscious necessity to conscious providence.
Exactly. Epoch 1 is the tragic period. That's Schicksal, or fate. In this earliest era, the intelligence experiences events as being governed by fate, which appears as a blind external power. Think of the ancient Greek tragedies, where downfall comes regardless of individual virtue or intent.
Right, you can't escape your
You
fate.
can't. The intelligence is restricted by this perceived external necessity. Whatever humanity achieves is seen as Schicksal, blind destiny. This period is the loss of the Golden Age and the downfall of primitive glory, where the world feels arbitrary and often cruel.
Then humanity learns to organize and structure itself. This brings us to the second epoch.
Epoch 2 is the period of natural law, or nature. What was previously perceived as blind fate is now revealed to be the operation of nature, a rational, knowable law. Uncontrolled free will, ungezügelte Willkür, is forced to serve a natural plan, slowly introducing a mechanical regularity into historical affairs through law, political systems, and social organization.
And we can ground this historically. Which periods exemplify this transition from fate to natural law?
Well, the source notes that this period begins with the rise of the great monarchical republic, a structure like Rome, which codified law and organized vast territories under a single rational system. This epoch ends when the universal state is theoretically established, providing the total legal framework for human life.
And the downfall of Rome itself.
The downfall of the Roman Empire is viewed not as a moral collapse, but as a necessary tribute to nature. A nature-intrictor tribute. It's the necessary self-destruction of an organic body when its function is complete, clearing the path for the next synthesis.
Now, the mechanism of history forces us, through the pressure of natural law and organization, to create structures that ultimately limit individual freedom for the sake of a global rationality. And this necessary limitation sets up the final stage.
Epoch 3, the period of providence. Vorstellung. This is the culmination. What appeared previously as fate, these arbitrary events, and then as nature, this mechanical law, will finally develop and manifest as providence. It's the moment where actions that seemed entirely without intention or conscious design, all the accidents of free will, are revealed to be purposeful, as if created by a conscious, rational design.
It's when the intelligence finally looks back and sees the absolute harmony that was operating unconsciously all along. It's the moment of maximum logical clarity for history itself.
History moves from unconscious chaos to conscious, revealed purpose. The whole story makes sense.
So we have completed this massive arc from the absolute subjective foundation of Ich Bin through the objective realm of matter and organization and across the temporal realm of history. Now, for the system to be truly complete, it has to return to its starting point, that original unity of the subjective and objective. But this time, it has to bring that unity out of the internal intellectual intuition and make it visible for everyone.
That return is structurally vital. It's the capstone. If the system stops at history or science, it's incomplete. It's a line that never becomes a circle. The source explains that the highest original ground of harmony between the subjective and objective lies in that intellectual intuition. Philosophy's task now is to bring that purely internal, non-sensuous intuition out of the subjective realm and make it completely objective, sensible, and undeniable.
And the mechanism for this final, incredible leap is art.
Art is declared the sole, true, and eternal organon and document of philosophy. This is arguably the most famous claim in the entire text. And you have to ask why. Because philosophy, which is confined to discursive language and abstract concepts, can only describe the unity of the conscious and the unconscious. It can talk about it, it can't display it.
Art, however, it can show it to you.
Yes. The function of art is to objectively represent this unceasing original identity, the ursprüngliche Identität of the inner creative action and the objective world. In a single artwork, the self sees its own infinite free activity made finite, harmonious, and external. It's a miracle made visible.
But this requires a special kind of creator, someone capable of making that internal, absolute principle external. That's where the concept of genius comes in, I assume.
The genius is the resolving element. The source defines genius as the capacity to resolve a contradiction, a wider brush that cannot be resolved by anything else, including mere common sense or methodical, step-by-step reflection. The genius manages to bridge the gap between conscious production and unconscious necessity.
So a scientist might consciously resolve a mechanical problem, but the genius unconsciously embeds an infinity into their work. Is that the idea?
Precisely. The artist, the Künstler, even when working with the greatest reflection and the most refined technique, unconsciously embeds an infinity, an Unendlichkeit, into their creation that no finite understanding can ever fully penetrate. You can analyze a masterpiece forever, but you will never exhaust its meaning. That infinity is the objective manifestation of the self's unlimited striving.
And this fundamentally distinguishes true art from just mere imitation.
The source is adamant about this. Art is distinct from the mere imitation or Nachahmung of nature. Nature's beauty is accidental. It's just the product of those blind forces we talked about. But art is the principle and norm for judging nature. The artist produces the unity that nature is only ever struggling toward. The creative act of the artist is identical to the original act of the self-creating spirit.
So let's define the essential character of the artwork itself. Beauty, Schönheit. The system makes a really vital differentiation here between beauty and sublimity, or Habenheit. And this distinction helps us understand how the idealist views the interaction between the self and the object.
It does. The difference rests entirely on how that infinite contradiction between the limited and the unlimited is handled in relation to the object and the viewer. First, beauty. In beauty, the infinite contradiction, the unendliche Widerspruch, is resolved in the object itself.
Okay, what's an example of that?
Think of a perfectly proportioned Greek statue or a harmonious classical symphony. The object appears complete, finite, and self-contained. It embodies a perfect unity, allowing the viewer's mind to just rest in that achieved harmony. There's no struggle.
Okay, so what about sublimity?
In sublimity, the contradiction is not resolved in the object. Instead, the object is so vast, so terrifying, or so overwhelming. Think of a massive, dark mountain range or a tempestuous seascape painting that the contradiction is heightened. The object challenges the understanding to its absolute limits.
And what does that do to the viewer?
It forces the contradiction to involuntarily resolve itself in the subjective intuition of the viewer. It forces you to affirm the infinite power of your own self over the object.
So the beautiful object is a perfect finished product, providing a sense of peace. The sublime object is an overwhelming force that forces the subject to recognize its own infinite capacity to comprehend it, providing a mix of terror and elevation.
Exactly. The sublime artwork forces the intelligence into an internal struggle, but that struggle itself affirms the infinite nature of the self. It proves that the subject is mightier than even the most overwhelming external force.
And this brings us right back to the intellectual intuition. The aesthetic intuition art is the objectively realized transcendental intuition. It makes the deepest philosophical principle sensible. You can see it and feel it.
And this leads to the ultimate convergence. The system asserts that science, which is philosophy when it's fully developed, and art, must ultimately converge and merge into one.
Why must they merge? Why can't they just remain separate, parallel disciplines?
Because where art is, science must eventually arrive. Art provides the model, the Vorbild. Science's task to analyze and fully explain that ultimate unity, to trace the path the genius took unconsciously, is an infinite task. Art, through genius, provides the instant, objective manifestation of that unity. It gives philosophy the finished product to analyze for centuries.
You can see this tension between the instantaneous insight of genius and the methodical process of science throughout history.
Oh, absolutely. The source suggests that Newton's system of gravitation might be considered a genius invention. It was a sudden, unifying insight that changed everything. But the philosophical principles of its underlying mechanism, the categories of relation that govern interaction and coexistence, were already contained in the original, necessary act of intuition. The genius brought it out into the daylight, but the principle was always there, waiting to be articulated by the philosopher. The system is complete because it demonstrates that the material world, history, and art are all necessary, logical stages in the self's journey toward total self-awareness.
Okay, let's try to unpack this monumental journey one last time. We've traveled from the singular, unshakable certainty of I am to the moment that self splits into subjective and objective forces. We saw how the necessary tension of that split generates the fundamental forces of matter, gravity, electricity, magnetism, and structures the world to the category of reciprocity. We then watched this principle unfold in time, traversing the grand trajectory of history in its three epochs: fate, nature, and providence. And finally, we found the singular role of artistic creation in demonstrating this entire unified system as a perfect objective model.
The big takeaway for you, the learner, is the sheer logical necessity that drives every single stage. The entire objective world is derived from the subjective, an expansion of a single self-producing activity. But, and this is key, reality itself is not merely an idea. It rests on that absolutely necessary feeling of constraint, that Gefühl des Zwangs.
The friction.
The friction. This constraint forces the self to limit itself and engage in reciprocal activity, the Wechselwirkung, not just with its own internal activities, but crucially with other intelligences. It is this mutual, necessary constraint among free subjects that validates and creates the shared, objective, material, and historical world we all inhabit.
The moment you realize that the logical structure of your own consciousness is the blueprint for the entire universe, that the same principles that define your ability to say, I am, also define the forces of nature, it changes everything you consider externally real. It forces you to see the world as a dynamic living system of tension, striving, and resolution.
And if, as this philosophy asserts, the aesthetic intuition, art, is the only objective manifestation of the highest philosophical principle, the ultimate unity of the conscious and unconscious, the absolute identity, this raises an important, provocative question for us now.
Which is?
If philosophy needs a concrete, sensible model of unified consciousness in every age, what modern human activity, beyond traditional painting or poetry, might serve as the next true document or organon for philosophical truth in the current epoch? What complex enterprise today most perfectly blends unconscious genius, technical mastery, and universal immediate unity, resolving that infinite contradiction? That's a thought for you to mull over as you see the world around you.